I used to believe everything they taught us in history class. I trusted the textbooks, the dates, the so-called heroes. But then I walked into a sociology lecture that shattered everything. What if I told you the version of history you know was carefully constructed, designed to protect power, not truth? This isn't conspiracy, it's sociology. And once you hear what I heard, you'll never look at the past the same way again. I remember the exact moment everything started to fall apart. It was my sophomore year, and I had already taken the usual history courses: the Founding Fathers, the French Revolution, World War II. Dates, treaties, declarations, neatly packaged, memorized, regurgitated. I thought I understood the past. I thought I knew how the world worked. Then came Professor Aldridge's class, Sociology of Knowledge. It wasn't supposed to be about history at all. It was sociology, a throwaway elective, I thought. But in that small, cold lecture hall with peeling posters on the walls and buzzing fluorescent lights, my entire understanding of reality began to unravel. She started the class with one sentence: "History is not what happened. History is what got written down." We laughed nervously. She didn't. Instead, she pulled out a copy of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, slammed it on the desk, and said, "You've been taught history from the top down. Kings, presidents, wars, but sociology asks, what about everyone else?" That week, we didn't talk about George Washington. We talked about the slaves he owned. We didn't celebrate Columbus. We dissected his journals and saw the genocide hidden between the lines. I was furious at first, not because the information was false, but because no one had ever told me the full story. I felt duped. My high school textbooks had sculpted a world of clean victories and noble intentions, but Aldridge showed us the footnotes, the erased, the silenced, the brutalized. She handed out a diagram the following class. It was a triangle. At the top, dominant narrative. At the base, lived reality. "This," she said, tapping the bottom with her pen, "is where sociology begins." I started reading differently, watching the news differently, asking questions like, who benefits from this version of events? Who gets left out? One day, she brought up the Vietnam War. I thought I knew the basics: Cold War tension, domino theory, tragic loss of life. But then she played us a recording of Noam Chomsky speaking in 1970. It wasn't a lecture, it was a condemnation, not of communism, but of American imperialism. I was stunned. And then came the quote that tattooed itself on my mind: "If the Nuremberg laws were applied, every post-war American president would have been hanged." It hit me like a truck. In sociology, you don't just study behavior, you interrogate power. And history, it turns out, is one of the most powerful weapons ever created. It frames who is remembered and who is erased, who gets called a rebel and who gets labeled a freedom fighter, whose pain is archived and whose is conveniently ignored. I called my dad that night and told him what I'd been learning. He was uncomfortable. "That sounds like rewriting history," he said. "Be careful with those liberal professors." I wanted to yell, "No, it's not rewriting, it's finally reading what was left out." But I didn't. I realized this was part of the problem. We're not just taught facts, we're trained into a national narrative, and questioning that narrative feels like betrayal, even when it's the truth. Professor Aldridge wasn't anti-American, she was anti-silence. She told us, loyalty doesn't mean shutting your eyes, it means caring enough to look deeper. That was the beginning of my undoing, and also my awakening. I began to see the world not just as it presents itself, but as it's structured. And those structures, they're historical, yes, but they're also deeply sociological. History may tell you when something happened, but sociology, it tells you why it happened, who it happened to, and why it keeps happening. And once you start seeing that, you can never unsee it. It was just a map, hanging on the classroom wall, the kind I'd seen in every classroom since I was 5 years old. Oceans in blue, continents shaped like puzzle pieces, the United States conveniently centered and bold. I never questioned it. until the day Professor Aldridge pulled it down. She replaced it with another version, one that looked wrong, at least at first. Africa was huge, Greenland looked tiny, Europe was unimpressive, South America stretched wide, no longer the slim figure I thought I knew. This, she said, is the Gall-Peters projection. Unlike the map you've known your whole life, this one shows land masses by actual area, not by Western political power. We stared at it in silence. It was jarring, even laughable, like the world had been stretched and squished for no reason. But she continued, the Mercator projection was designed for colonial navigation. It made Europe look powerful, central, superior, but that's not geography, that's ideology. I felt my stomach tighten. It was just a map, and yet it was so much more. All those years I had spent looking at the world through this warped image, not realizing I was absorbing a subconscious message, that some places mattered more than others. That class broke me open. She moved on to historical timelines. She rolled out a giant visual of two side-by-side timelines. One showed the history I had learned, conquests, kings, revolutions. The other, it traced uprisings, indigenous resistance, peasant rebellions, worker strikes, women's marches, all the moments that never made it into our glossy textbooks. This isn't revisionism, she told us. It's restoration. It's putting back what was deliberately left out. I remember going back to my dorm and pulling out my old high school history book. I flipped through it with new eyes. I noticed the words used, how colonizers were explorers, how native resistance was called violence, how slaves were described as laborers. Laborers. I felt sick. Words weren't just words anymore. They were tools, sharp ones, capable of cutting entire populations out of the past. Professor Aldridge assigned us to rewrite a textbook passage. Pick any historical moment, she said, and reframe it from the perspective of those on the margins. I chose the Louisiana Purchase. Instead of focusing on Jefferson, I wrote about the native nations whose lands were suddenly sold without their consent, tribes that didn't even have a seat at the table. I dug into their oral histories, found archived letters, and listened to descendants' testimonies on YouTube. What I found broke my heart and reshaped it. Sociology had turned me into something dangerous, a skeptic of the official record, and the more I questioned, the more I saw. Not just in textbooks, but in museums, holidays, statues, even childhood songs. I remembered singing "This Land Is Your Land" in third grade, not knowing the verses that had been scrubbed from the school-approved version, the ones that talked about hungry people and private property lines guarded by no trespassing signs, the real verses, removed to protect a cleaner narrative. I started wondering, if they hid verses from a folk song, what else have they hidden? History, I realized, is edited by those in power, but sociology hands you the red pen and says, now look again. Aldridge once told us, your education is political whether you like it or not. The question is, will you be complicit in the silence or will you learn to speak? I didn't have an answer then, but I was beginning to find one. If Chapter 1 cracked the surface and Chapter 2 broke my foundation, then what came next shattered the idols I'd been raised to worship. We began our next unit with a simple question from Professor Aldridge. Who decides who becomes a hero? Without hesitation, people threw out names: Lincoln, Churchill, Mandela, MLK. She smiled, then added, and how do we treat those who challenge those choices? That class, we dove into the life of COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to infiltrate and disrupt civil rights movements. I had never heard of it before, not in high school, not in media, nowhere. Turns out, while I was taught to honor Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, no one mentioned that in the final years of his life, he was labeled a dangerous radical by the very state that now celebrates him with a holiday. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategy. Aldridge showed us a chilling quote from the FBI. We must prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. This was about King. This was about Malcolm. This was about any black leader who demanded structural change rather than symbolic recognition. And then she dropped the hammer. We don't just kill people. We sanitize them. We smooth their edges, erase their anger, frame them as dreamers instead of fighters. It made me sick. All my life I'd thought heroes were chosen because they were good, but now I understood they were chosen because they were useful. I thought about Rosa Parks, the sweet old lady who refused to give up her seat. That was the image I'd grown up with. But the full truth? Rosa Parks was a seasoned activist, trained at the Highlander Folk School, deeply involved in organizing. She wasn't just tired, she was strategic, calculated, brave, angry. But that version of her story doesn't fit into children's books, so they softened her. And then we looked at Columbus. In elementary school, I had drawn pictures of ships and worn paper hats for Columbus Day. I had memorized, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. No one mentioned the mutilations, the slavery, the sex trafficking, the suicides. No one said he wrote in his diary that the native people were so kind they'd make excellent servants. Aldrich looked at us and said, "They didn't hide this from you because it wasn't true. They hid it because it was true." That line stuck with me. We also talked about national myths, stories that bind a people together. Every country has them, but the more we looked, the more I realized that many of these myths were created not to inspire truth, but to maintain order. America as a land of opportunity, the West as the cradle of civilization, the Constitution as a flawless document, the flag as untouchable. One day I asked Aldrich, if we can't trust the myths, what do we believe in? She paused. Believe in the people who were never allowed to speak, she said. Find the records they left behind and listen to the stories that made them dangerous to power. That was the day I stopped seeing statues as just statues. They became warnings, memorials to half-told stories, proof that memory can be manipulated. Sociology doesn't just teach you what happened. It teaches you how we remember what happened, and how those memories shape what we believe we are. And once I understood that, I couldn't walk through the world the same way. I never thought of silence as a weapon, until sociology showed me how powerful it is. We were in week 10 when Professor Aldrich wrote 2 words on the board: historical amnesia. At first I thought it meant forgetting, simple memory loss. But no, it was more deliberate than that. She explained, historical amnesia is when a society chooses not to remember. It's a political act disguised as a lack of knowledge. That hit me harder than I expected. I began to think about all the things I hadn't been taught, not just what was distorted or reframed, but what was completely erased. We started that week with Japanese internment camps in the U.S. during World War II. I knew the words. I didn't know the reality. I didn't know about the barbed wire, the freezing temperatures, the children in makeshift classrooms, the American flags flying above prison camps built for citizens. And worst of all, I didn't know that no one around me seemed to know either. Silence, Aldrich said, isn't absence, it's design. We talked about the Congo under King Leopold, a regime so brutal it cut off limbs as punishment for not meeting rubber quotas. 10 million dead. 10 million. I'd taken European history, but no one had ever mentioned it, not once. I sat in my dorm that night, thinking about how selective knowledge really is. It's not about what we're capable of learning, it's about what we're permitted to know. And who decides that? A few days later, Aldrich brought up a concept I'd never heard before: epistemic violence, the violence of erasure, of denying someone the right to be known, remembered, documented. Burning a village is one kind of violence, she said. Erasing that village from the historical record is another, and just as damaging. That concept stayed with me. I thought about the native boarding schools in the U.S. and Canada, where children were taken from their families, forced to abandon their language, their clothes, their spirituality. Many died. Some were buried in unmarked graves. For decades, no one talked about it. Some didn't even know it happened. I used to think history was just about the past. But sociology taught me that forgetting is something we do now to protect systems still in power. I remember one class when we discussed the Stonewall Uprising. I'd only ever heard of Pride as a colorful parade, but I didn't know the riots, the police brutality, the trans women of color who fought back. I didn't know about the silence that followed, or how even within LGBTQ+ communities, some stories were prioritized while others, like Marsha P. Johnson's, were sidelined. That silence wasn't accidental. It was structured. And that's the part that sociology forced me to see. Silence doesn't just happen. It's cultivated, maintained, funded, rewarded. It's in the curriculum boards that approve what textbooks say and what they leave out. It's in the national holidays we celebrate and the ones we ignore. It's in the moments we say, let's not bring politics into this, when everything around us is already political. I stopped trusting silence. It used to feel neutral. Now it felt like complicity. Sociology didn't give me all the answers. It gave me better questions, like, why did I never learn about these things? Who benefits from my ignorance? What would change if we remembered differently? I started to see silence as a choice, a dangerous one. And once you see it that way, you begin to speak louder, not because you have the answers, but because you finally realize just how many voices have been stolen. There's something no one tells you when you start asking difficult questions. Once you begin to see the machinery behind history, the gears of power, silence, distortion, there's no going back. One afternoon, near the end of the semester, Professor Aldridge wrote this quote on the board: "The past is never dead. It's not even past." William Faulkner. I stared at it longer than I expected. It echoed every instinct I'd been developing. Because here's the truth. Once you realize that history is not a neutral archive, but a battleground of narratives, you start to see its fingerprints everywhere. In your neighborhood, in your job, in the way people look at you or avoid looking at you. History is not just what happened. It's what continues to happen, shaped by the stories we choose to uphold and those we bury. I saw it when I visited a museum and noticed how the slavery exhibit was squeezed into a dark hallway, while the founding fathers had a marble rotunda and gold plaques. I saw it when we studied housing policies and discovered how redlining wasn't some ancient policy from the 1930s. It was the blueprint for the city I lived in now. I looked at my college campus differently too. I had walked past statues every day without knowing who they were, men who signed bills that displaced indigenous communities, or philanthropists whose wealth came from exploitative industries. The plaques never mentioned any of that. I thought about how history was being curated in real time, in museums, on social media, in classrooms, in protests, even in the comments section under viral videos. One day, we had a guest speaker, a local sociologist who worked in community justice. She said something that haunted me. Your country's version of history is like a haunted house. The blood has been cleaned off the walls, but the screams still echo if you're willing to listen. That's what sociology did to me. It taught me how to listen for the echoes, to see the past not as a sealed vault, but as a living organism, breathing through policies, economics, borders, race, memory. I no longer saw history as a list of dates. I saw it in incarceration rates, in school funding gaps, in which names were remembered on monuments and which were buried with no headstones. The truth is, historians give us the bones, but sociology gives us the X-ray. It shows us the fractures, the trauma, the ways old wounds become present pain. One night I was walking back to my dorm when I passed a group of students protesting tuition hikes. Someone held up a sign that read, "Debt is modern-day indentured servitude." A year ago, I would have rolled my eyes. That night, I stood with them, because now I knew I had the tools to trace how economic inequality wasn't accidental. It was inherited, engineered, historical. Aldrich warned us that this awakening wouldn't be comfortable. You'll lose the simplicity of good guys and bad guys, she said, but you'll gain something far more powerful, vision. She was right. I began to notice the fear in people's eyes when history was challenged, when statues fell, when holidays were re-examined, when someone dared to say, that version isn't the whole truth. It wasn't about facts. It was about identity. When you change history, you threaten people's sense of self. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake. And now, when someone tells me that's just the past, I smile and respond, then why are you still defending it? They taught us to memorize dates, but not to question why those dates mattered. Now you know better. If this journey opened your eyes even a little, don't stop here. Share this story, challenge the narrative, and keep asking, who wrote the version we call truth? Your voice is part of the history we need. Use it.